believes our social and political nature is not the result of calculation, as we will see in Hobbes, Locke, and other social contract theorists, but such things as love, affection, friendship, and sympathy are the grounds of political life and are rooted in our logos. It is speech, or it is speech that allows a sharing in these qualities that make us fully human. But to say, of course, that man is political by nature is not just to say that we become fully human by participating with others in a city. It means more than this. The form of association that leads to our perfection is necessarily something particularistic. The city is always a particular city. It is always this or that particular city. The polis, as Aristotle, as well as Plato, clearly understand, is a small society, what could be called today a closed society. A society that leads to our perfection, that leads us to complete and perfect our telos, must be held together by bonds of trust, right? Of friendship, of camaraderie. A society based simply on the mutual calculation of interests could not be a real political society for Aristotle. We cannot trust all people, Aristotle seems to say. Trust can only be extended to a fairly small circle of friends and fellow citizens. Only a small city, small enough to be governed by relations of trust, can be political in Aristotle's sense of the term. The alternative to the city, the empire, can only be ruled despotically. There can be no relations of trust in a large imperial despotism. So it follows, in one sense, that when Aristotle says that man is by nature a political animal and that the city is by nature, the city can never be a universal state. It can never be something that incorporates all of humankind. It can never be a kind of cosmopolis, a world state, or even a league of states or nations. The universal state will never allow for, or does not allow for, the kind of self-perfection that a small, self-governing polis will have. The city, as Aristotle understands, will always exist in a world with other cities or other states based on different principles that might be hostile to one's own. That is to say, not even the best city, on Aristotle's account, can afford to be without a foreign policy. A good citizen of a democracy will not be the good citizen of another kind of regime. Partisanship and loyalty to one's own way of life are required by a healthy city. To put the argument in terms that Polemarchus from Plato's Republic would have known, friend and enemy are thus natural and ineradicable categories of political life. Just as we cannot be friends with all persons, so the city cannot be friends with all other cities, or the state with all other states. War and the virtues necessary for war are as natural to the city as are the virtues of friendship, trust, and camaraderie that are also necessary. Note that in the opening pages of the book, Aristotle doesn't say anything yet about what kind of city or regime is best. All he tells us is that we are the polis animal by nature, and that to achieve our ends it will be necessary to live in a polis. But what kind of polis? How should it be governed? By the one, the few, the many, or some combination of these three categories? At this point, we know only the most general features of what a polis is. It must be small enough to be governed by a common language of justice. It is not enough merely to speak the same words, But in a sense, citizens must have certain common experiences, certain common memory and experience that shape a city and a people. The large, polyglot, multi-ethnic communities of today would not be, on Aristotle's account, allow for sufficient mutual trust and friendship to count as a healthy political community. So Aristotle seems to be offering, in some respects, a kind of criticism of the kind of states with which we are most familiar. Think about that when you have your sections or when you talk about this text with your friends. What is Aristotle saying about us? The citizens of such a city can only reach their telos or perfection through participating in the offices, in the ruling offices of a city. And again, a large cosmopolitan state may allow each individual the freedom to live as he or she likes, but this is not freedom as Aristotle understands it. Freedom only comes through the exercise of political responsibility, which means responsibility for and oversight of one's fellow citizens and the common good. It follows for him that freedom does not mean living as we like, but freedom is informed by a certain sense of restraint, an awareness that not all things are permitted, that the good society will be one that promotes a sense of moderation, restraint, and self-control, self-governance, as Adiamantus says, that are inseparable from the experience of freedom. So in many ways, Aristotle there offers, as does Plato, a certain kind of critique of the modern, or even the ancient, democratic theory of freedom, which is living as one likes. So you can see these opening pages of the book, dense, argument being condensed in very deep ways, carry a great deal of freight. There's a lot in there that needs to be unpacked, and I've only tried to do a little of that here with you today, to go over sort of what Aristotle is suggesting in this idea of man, the polis animal. But whatever we may think about this view, whether we like it or don't like it, or whatever your view might be, we must also confront another famous, more like infamous, doctrine that is also very much a part of Book 1. And I refer to his arguments for the naturalness of slavery. Aristotle tells us that slavery is natural. The naturalness of slavery is said to follow from the belief that inequality is the basic rule between human beings. Aristotle and Thomas Jefferson seem to disagree over the basic fact of human experience, whether it's equality or inequality. If this is true, Aristotle's Politics seems to stand condemned as the most anti-democratic book ever written. Is that true? Aristotle's claim about naturalness seems to require, as he tells us, slavery. The categorical distinction of humanity into masters and slaves. How to understand that? Again, Aristotle's argument is deeply compact and will be easily misunderstood if you only read it once. It will just as likely be misunderstood if you read it 3, 4, 5, or 10 times if you are not attentive to what he's saying. You must learn to read closely. What was Aristotle saying? In the first place, it's important that we avoid, I think, two equally unhelpful ways of responding to this. The first, which one finds among many modern-day commentators, many kind of neo-Aristotelians, we might call them, is to simply avert our eyes from the harsh, unappealing aspects of Aristotle's thought and proceed as if he never actually said or meant such things. We need to avoid the temptation, in many ways understandable as it might be, to airbrush or sanitize Aristotle, to make him seem more politically correct for modern readers. And yet we should also avoid the second, equally powerful temptation, which is to reject Aristotle out of hand because his views do not correspond with our own. The question is, what did Aristotle mean by slavery? What did he think was, who or what did he think was the slave by nature? Until we understand what he meant, we have no reason to either accept or reject his argument. The first point worth noting about this is that Aristotle did not simply assume slavery was natural because it was practiced virtually everywhere in the ancient world. You will notice that he frames his analysis in the form of a debate. He says, at the outset of his argument, there are some, he says, indicating this is an opinion held by many people, there are some who believe that slavery is natural because ruling and being ruled is a pervasive distinction that one sees all societies practice. But he says others believe that the distinction between master and slave is not natural, but is based on force or coercion. Even in Aristotle's time, it appears slavery was a controversial institution.